The afternoon light in Charleston fell golden through the hanging ferns on the porch of 14 Magnolia Street. Marcus Hayes stood on the bottom step in a faded flannel shirt. He had rehearsed the words for 3 nights. Words like different worlds. Words like, let her go. Words like, I am not enough. Victoria Sterling lifted one finger and pressed it gently against his lips before a single syllable escaped. Behind her, the porch boards creaked in the sea breeze. Inside, Lily was waiting. In one silent gesture, a billionaire stopped the man she loved from breaking her heart a second time. 3 years before that afternoon, on a Thursday morning when a soft spring rain tapped against the windows of Charleston's oldest coffee shop, Victoria Sterling sat at her usual table near the glass. Her tablet displayed a property inventory report, columns of addresses and assessment values glowing faintly against the gray light. To anyone watching, she looked exactly as she always did. Composed, precise, the kind of woman who could negotiate a 9-figure acquisition before lunch and never raise her voice. The shop sat on the corner of Magnolia and King Street, where old brick buildings still held the warmth of a city that believed in ironwork balconies and front porch conversations. Victoria came here 3 mornings a week. She told herself it was because the coffee was exceptional. That explanation had stopped being true approximately 2 years earlier. The real reason arrived every Thursday at 7:45 in a Ford F-150 with a cracked taillight and sawdust on the dashboard. The bell above the door chimed. Marcus Hayes stepped inside carrying a cardboard box under one arm, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing work boots dusted with sawdust and a denim jacket that had seen better decades. He looked like every honest man America was built on, but rarely remembered to honor. His smile appeared the moment he spotted her. Morning, Victoria. Her heart betrayed her immediately. It always did. Morning, Marcus. He set the box beside her table. Brought those shells, I promised. Lily polished them herself last night. She wanted to make sure you got them before the weekend. At the mention of his daughter, Victoria felt the familiar warmth she never allowed herself to show. 8-year-old Lily Hayes had somehow slipped past every wall Victoria spent years constructing. Tell her thank you for me. She will be happy to hear that. Marcus pulled out the chair across from her. Mind if I sit for a minute? Of course. The rain continued its gentle rhythm against the glass. A few customers murmured in the background. Everything felt ordinary, peaceful, safe. Then Marcus smiled in a way she had never seen before, a smile that carried nervousness and pride in equal measure. Actually, I have some news. Victoria lowered her tablet. I finally went on a date. For one brief second, the entire room seemed to disappear. The rain, the voices, the smell of cinnamon and fresh ground beans, all of it faded into a silence so complete that Victoria could hear her own pulse hammering against her ribs. A date? Yeah. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. First one in years. Her name is Rachel. We met at one of Lily's school events. He paused, and a gentleness crossed his face that Victoria had only ever seen directed at his daughter. She is kind, patient, and Lily likes her. That matters more than anything. Something sharp and quiet moved through Victoria's chest. Not anger, not jealousy, something worse. The particular fear that arrives when you realize the person you love may finally belong to someone else. The kind of fear that does not shout, but whispers. And what it whispers is too late. That is wonderful, Marcus. You deserve happiness. The words sounded distant even to her. That means a lot coming from you. He smiled gratefully, then stood and reached for his jacket. I should get going. Job site across town. Custom staircase restoration. Client wants it done by Friday. Of course, the bell chimed. The door closed. The shop grew quiet. Victoria watched his truck disappear down the rain-slicked street, its brake lights blurring red against the wet pavement. Her hand trembled. The coffee cup slipped from her fingers and shattered against the tile floor. Ceramic pieces scattered across the dark wood. Several customers turned. A barista rushed over, crouching beside the mess, asking if she was all right. Victoria barely heard her. She stared at the empty doorway and whispered words she had buried for longer than she cared to admit. She cannot love him the way I do. That same afternoon, Victoria returned to the 42nd floor of King Street Tower, where the offices of Sterling Heritage Holdings occupied an entire wing overlooking Charleston Harbor. The view from her desk stretched across church steeples, palmetto-lined avenues, and the silver curve of the Cooper River bending toward the Atlantic. Most days, the view steadied her, reminded her of scale and permanence, of the legacy her father had spent 50 years building. Today, it felt like decoration surrounding something hollow. She had not been able to read a single report since returning. The broken coffee cup kept replaying in her mind. The way it slipped, the way it shattered, the way the sound seemed louder than it should have been, as though the cup had been holding something heavier than coffee. Spencer Calloway knocked twice before entering. He was 52, silver-haired, impeccably tailored, and carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who believed proximity to wealth entitled him to opinions about everyone beneath it. He placed a manila folder on Victoria's desk and opened it to a flagged page. Priority tenant review for the Magnolia District. His finger stopped at a highlighted name, Marcus Hayes. He looked up with a thin smile. I still do not understand why we continue subsidizing rent for an hourly wage black craftsman in a heritage neighborhood. Charleston has hundreds of families, better suited for a district like Magnolia. Victoria did not raise her voice. She rarely needed to. She stood slowly and let the silence stretch until Spencer's smile faded into something more uncertain. He is the best tenant I have ever had, she said. Each word landed like a stone, dropped into still water. He maintains the property better than our own contractors. He contributes to the neighborhood in ways your spreadsheets will never measure. And if you make a comment like that in front of me again, you will answer to the Sterling Oversight Board directly. Spencer gathered his folder without another word and left. But something moved behind his eyes as the door closed. A calculation Victoria did not catch because her mind was already somewhere else. She sank back into her chair and stared at the harbor for a long time, trying to separate the dull ache of Marcus's announcement from the sharp edge of Spencer's words, and finding that both cut in the same direction. 20 minutes later, her phone rang. Della Boudreau. Della was 66, a former secretary to Victoria's late father, Harold Sterling, and one of the few people alive who remembered the old man's private decisions with perfect clarity. Victoria, honey, I have been meaning to tell you something for a while now. It is about the Hayes boy on Magnolia. Victoria leaned back. What about him? Your father arranged that rent reduction himself, back in 2020, before the diagnosis. He hired Marcus to restore the walnut staircase in the family house on Ligare Street, the Charleston Single House Project. Della paused, and her voice softened the way it always did when she spoke about Harold. Your father called him the finest craftsman he had met in 40 years. He wanted Marcus on Magnolia specifically, said the neighborhood deserved someone who understood how buildings remember their history. Victoria stared at the harbor. For 3 years, she had believed Marcus was simply a tenant she happened to notice, a man whose quiet decency caught her attention by coincidence. Now she learned that her father had seen him first, had recognized something in Marcus that existed beyond every line Spencer Calloway would ever try to draw between people. The realization shifted something deep inside her. Like a foundation settling into ground it had always been meant to occupy. She thanked Della and hung up. Then she sat alone in the fading afternoon light, watching the sun descend toward the water, understanding for the first time that the man she thought she discovered had actually been placed in her life by the one person whose judgment she trusted more than her own. The memory arrived without warning, the way important memories often do, surfacing not because you call them, but because they decide it is time to be remembered. October of 2022, a moving truck rolling down Magnolia Street. Beneath a sky heavy with the remnants of a coastal storm, Victoria had been there that afternoon to inspect a damaged fence after the wind had pulled several boards loose along the property line. Her manager spent 20 minutes complaining about insurance deductibles and contractor schedules, while Victoria studied the damage and made notes on her phone. Then a door on the truck opened, and Marcus Hayes climbed out carrying a sleeping 5-year-old girl, wrapped in a thin lavender blanket. His movements were careful, protective, deliberate. He held her with one arm beneath her back, and the other cradling her head against his shoulder. He carried Lily as though the entire world depended on her feeling safe, as though the only architecture that mattered was the small body in his arms. Victoria learned later that Naomi Hayes had died of cancer only 3 weeks earlier. Marcus had packed their apartment in Savannah in 4 days, sold everything that would not fit in the truck, and driven south to Charleston, with a daughter who still whispered mama in her sleep, and a grief so fresh it had not yet learned its own shape. The house at 14 Magnolia was small. The paint had faded to the color of old cream. The porch leaned slightly to the right, and the garden had gone wild with untended jasmine. Yet Marcus looked at the house, then at Lily, and smiled. "What do you think, kiddo? New adventure?" Lily opened sleepy eyes. "It smells like the ocean," she whispered. "I like it." Victoria had expected complaints. Most tenants complained about something within the first hour. Instead, she saw gratitude in the eyes of a man who had just buried his wife and driven 100 miles with everything he owned to give his daughter a porch that smelled like salt water. 2 weeks later, a sudden storm damaged the porch roof of Mrs. Wilkes, the 78-year-old widow who lived at the end of the block. Before the maintenance crew could even schedule an assessment, Marcus spent an entire Saturday on a ladder in the November wind, replacing shingles and reinforcing the support beams with wood he had salvaged from a demolition site on James Island. His hands still carried burn marks from a fire in his garage several nights before, a fire he never explained to anyone, though a neighbor later told Victoria she had seen him burning a box of women's clothing at 2 in the morning, standing perfectly still while the flames rose and fell in the dark. Nobody paid him for the work on Mrs. Wilkes's porch. Nobody asked him to do it. He simply showed up, the way he seemed to show up for everything, without announcement and without expectation. Then came Christmas. A patrol officer pulled Marcus over on a Tuesday night, on the road between the construction site and home. The officer asked for identification 3 times, despite Marcus committing no violation. He asked Marcus to step out of the vehicle. Lily sat in the back seat, silent, watching through the window with eyes too steady for a 5-year-old. He never filed a complaint. He never mentioned it to the neighbors. The only reason Victoria knew was that he arrived 12 minutes late to sign his lease renewal the following morning. When she asked why, he offered a single sentence that would stay with her for years. "Charleston is prettier if you are patient with it." That was the moment Victoria Sterling knew she had begun to fall in love with him. Not because of the words themselves, but because of everything behind them. A man who had lost his wife, rebuilt his life in a city that did not always welcome him, and still chose to see beauty instead of bitterness. The annual Magnolia Spring Fair arrived on a Saturday so bright and warm that half the town seemed to pour into Maple Square before noon. Colorful banners fluttered above the sidewalks. The scent of kettle corn and low-country barbecue drifted through the afternoon air, while children chased each other between craft booths and a jazz trio played standards near the gazebo. Marcus stood behind the school fundraiser table, helping Lily arrange boxes of homemade cookies she had decorated with purple icing and crooked stars. Every few minutes, someone stopped to greet him. He answered every conversation with the same easy warmth that made people feel noticed and remembered. The kind of warmth that could not be rehearsed, because it came from a man who simply paid attention to the people around him. Then, Rachel arrived. She carried a tray of oatmeal bars, wrapped in wax paper, and wore a light blue cardigan that caught the breeze. Her smile was natural, unhurried, the kind of smile that suggested she had never needed to perform confidence, because she had always possessed it quietly. Marcus brightened when he saw her. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, just enough for Victoria to notice from 30 yards away near the jazz stage. And somehow, that restraint made it worse, because it looked real. "You made it," Marcus said. "I told you I would." Rachel laughed. "Besides, Lily made me promise these would be the best cookies in town." Lily beamed. "That is because they are." Within moments, the 3 of them were talking, with the ease of people who had known each other longer than they actually had. Rachel crouched to accept a cookie from Lily, and the little girl smiled at her with a warmth that sent a quiet crack through something Victoria had been holding together for 3 years. Victoria watched from the edge of the jazz stage area, feeling something unfamiliar settle over her like coastal fog. For years, she had lived in a world where competition was measured in contracts, appraisals, and closing statements. This was different. There was no strategy, no negotiation, no meeting to prepare for, just the quiet, devastating realization that another woman was beginning to occupy space in Marcus's life that Victoria had secretly imagined filling herself. A couple she recognized as friends of her late father strolled past. The woman leaned toward her husband and murmured, just loudly enough for Victoria to hear. "Is that Victoria Sterling's tenant, the one dating the schoolteacher? I always assumed she kept that house discounted for other reasons." The husband shushed her, but the damage was already done. The words carried the particular cruelty of people who believed their whispers were invisible. Victoria did not turn around. Her fingers tightened around her cup until the tips went white. Before she could leave, a familiar voice broke through. "Miss Victoria." Lily came running across the grass and threw her arms around Victoria's waist, with the uncomplicated force of a child who had never learned to second-guess affection. Marcus and Rachel followed a few steps behind. Lily pointed excitedly toward the Ferris wheel rising above the fairground. "Daddy won 2 tickets. You should come with us." Marcus chuckled. "I think Miss Victoria probably has more important things to do." Victoria looked at him, then at Rachel, then back at Lily's upturned face. "Actually," she said softly, "that sounds kind of perfect." Rachel smiled politely, without defense and without hostility. She was simply a kind woman enjoying a spring afternoon, and that was what made it hurt, more than any confrontation ever could. Because Victoria could not compete with kindness, she could only stand beside it and wonder when the world had decided she was not allowed to have what she wanted. After the Ferris wheel, Rachel received a phone call from a colleague at the school and stepped away to take it near the lemonade stand. Marcus volunteered to help carry folding chairs for one of the charity booths across the square. That left Victoria and Lily alone at a wooden bench beneath an ancient live oak, draped with curtains of Spanish moss, one of Charleston's oldest trees, standing in the park like a patient elder who had watched generations of this city argue and reconcile beneath its branches. Lily swung her legs beneath the bench and studied Victoria with an expression far too serious for an 8-year-old. The afternoon light filtered through the moss above them, casting dappled patterns across the grass. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria smiled. "That depends. Is it a difficult question?" "Maybe." Lily tilted her head, considering. "Why do you look sad whenever Daddy talks about Miss Rachel?" The question landed like a stone in still water. Children, Victoria realized, often noticed what adults worked hardest to hide. They had not yet learned the social agreements that required people to pretend they did not see what was plainly visible. "I do not think I look sad," she said carefully. Lily gave her a look that suggested she was not convinced. "You kind of do. Right here." She pointed to the corners of her own eyes. "Your smile stays, but your eyes change." Victoria glanced toward the fairground, where Marcus was stacking chairs. His sleeves rolled to the elbows, laughing at something a volunteer had said. "Your father deserves happiness, Lily." "I know." Lily smiled. "That was not my question." Victoria could not help laughing. "You are very persistent. Daddy says I get that from my mom." The smile lingered before fading slightly. Lily looked down at the bench, tracing a grain in the wood with her finger. Then she spoke again, and her voice carried a weight that no 8-year-old should have known how to hold. "At school, some kids say Daddy does not belong on Magnolia Street." She said it without tears, without drama, with the practiced steadiness of a child who had learned early that certain kinds of cruelty arrived without warning and left without apology. Then she continued, "Do you know Daddy always calls you first? When I won my spelling award, he called you before anyone. When the roof leaked last winter, he called you. When I broke my arm 3 years ago, you came to the hospital before almost everyone." She paused. "Even before Grandma." Victoria swallowed hard. Lily was not wrong about any of it. "You remember all that?" "Of course." Lily smiled. "I pay attention." Then she asked the question Victoria never expected to hear spoken aloud by anyone, least of all an 8-year-old girl sitting beneath a live oak in the middle of a spring fair. "Why do you not just marry my daddy?" The sounds of the fair seemed to vanish. Somewhere nearby, the jazz trio played a slow waltz. Children laughed near the carousel. A church bell tolled in the distance. Yet Victoria heard none of it. She stared at Lily, unable to speak, unable to look away from those clear, honest eyes that had just given voice to a future Victoria had only ever allowed herself to imagine in silence. "Sweetheart," she began, "life is a little more complicated than that. Adults always say that." Lily sighed dramatically. Before Victoria could respond, Marcus returned carrying 2 lemonade cups. He handed one to Victoria. "Everything okay over here?" Lily grinned mischievously. "We were talking about you." Marcus laughed. "That sounds dangerous." Victoria managed to smile, but her heart felt different now, heavier and lighter at the same time. The way a thing feels when it has finally been named. 3 days after the spring fair, Marcus finished installing a custom bookshelf restoration at a law office on Broad Street. As he packed his tools, the receptionist handed him a folder containing a thank you note and a complimentary copy of Charleston Business Quarterly. He almost tossed the magazine into his truck without looking. Then a photograph on the cover stopped him cold. The woman smiling beside the headline was unmistakable: Victoria Starling. Beneath her photograph, the words made his pulse slow: "The woman who owns Charleston's history. A $2.1 billion heritage portfolio." Marcus read the article once, then again, then a third time, sitting in the cab of his truck while the engine ticked cool in the afternoon heat. The numbers barely seemed real. Hundreds of properties across 3 states. Luxury developments, restoration endowments, board seats. According to the article, Victoria Sterling was not simply a landlord who happened to own a few houses on Magnolia Street. She was one of the wealthiest women in South Carolina. He sat there for 10 silent minutes. The magazine rested on the passenger seat, while 3 years of small kindnesses rearranged themselves inside his head. The leaded glass windows she had restored in his front parlor, at no charge. The entire electrical system she replaced at a price she called salvage parts. A price he now understood could not possibly have been real. The rent that never increased, not once in 3 years, while every other house on the block had tripled. The way she always seemed to be in the neighborhood when something needed attention, as though 14 Magnolia Street occupied a permanent position on her calendar that no board meeting or acquisition could displace. That afternoon, Marcus drove downtown to Sterling Heritage Holdings. The lobby of King Street Tower felt like another country. Marble floors reflected afternoon light from towering windows. Employees moved with quiet efficiency through corridors that smelled of polished wood and fresh flowers. A security guard at the elevator bank stopped him immediately. "Do you have an appointment?" Marcus gave his name. The guard checked a list on his screen, frowned, and asked him to wait. A second guard approached with the same questions, then a third. Standing slightly too close, arms folded, Marcus waited patiently, hands at his sides, his face revealing nothing. He had learned long ago that reacting only gave certain people the satisfaction they were looking for. Finally, Victoria herself stepped off a nearby elevator. The moment she saw him in the lobby, surprise flashed across her face. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" He held up the magazine. "You forgot to tell me something." They walked to a small outdoor terrace, overlooking the harbor. The afternoon breeze moved gently through potted palmettos along the railing. As they stepped through the glass door, Marcus heard Spencer Calloway's voice drifting from a nearby corridor, pitched low, but perfectly audible. "So this is the one Sterling keeps on Magnolia. Finally got invited upstairs, did he?" Marcus did not turn. His jaw tightened once, then relaxed. Victoria did not hear it. She was already walking toward the railing, her back to the corridor, her eyes on the harbor. "Why did you never tell me?" Marcus asked. "Because I liked being Victoria. Just Victoria. Not the portfolio. Not the name on the building." "You are still Victoria." A sad smile touched her lips. "You say that now, but I've watched that magazine change the way people look at me my entire life. It becomes the only thing they see." They stood together for a long moment, watching boats move across the harbor in the late golden light. Then Marcus spoke quietly. "I need time to process this." Victoria's eyes lowered for a moment. "I understand." He left the building without looking back. Neither of them realized how much those simple words would cost. Because for the first time since they met, Marcus began pulling away. And for the first time in years, Victoria feared that the truth about who she was might erase the one person who saw past all of it. The weeks that followed moved in a kind of careful silence that neither Marcus nor Victoria knew how to break. The easy rhythm they had built over 3 years dissolved slowly into polite messages and measured distance. Marcus still answered her texts. Victoria still personally reviewed every maintenance request involving his house. But something invisible now stood between them, and every attempt to reach across it only made the gap feel wider. Every time Marcus looked at her, he no longer saw only the woman who drank coffee with him on rainy Thursday mornings. He saw corporate towers, private security teams, and a world so distant from his sawdust-covered hands that it felt impossible to bridge. He told himself the distance was practical. He told himself it was responsible. He told himself that a man who drove a 15-year-old truck and measured his income by the project had no business imagining a future beside a woman whose net worth required 12 digits to write. He increased his workload, accepting restoration commissions for 4 old houses on James Island, just to fill the hours that used to belong to Thursday mornings. The coffee shop came and went without him. 2 weeks, then 3. Rachel filled the spaces he left behind. One late afternoon, they walked together along Battery Park as the sun dropped toward the harbor and the old live oaks cast long shadows across the promenade. Rachel was thoughtful, patient, genuine. She laughed at his humor without performing. She listened when he talked about Lily without redirecting the conversation toward herself. She was present in the quiet, uncomplicated way of someone who simply wanted to be where she was. Walking beside her beneath strings of golden light that reflected off the water, Marcus felt something close to peace. Not excitement. Not the breathless pull that rearranges your chest when someone walks into a room. Just the steady, manageable comfort of a woman who showed up without complication. After 3 years of carrying every weight alone, comfort felt like enough. He told himself peace and love might be the same thing. Across town, Victoria sat alone at her desk on the 42nd floor, staring at numbers that should have demanded her attention. The quarterly reports blurred on her screen. Instead, she had finally launched the internal audit she had been postponing for months, the one she had avoided because a part of her feared what she would find. Della Boudreau helped her pull archived expense records for the Magnolia Heritage District Restoration Fund. Together, they spread the files across Victoria's conference table and read them line by line. The numbers told a story Spencer Calloway never intended anyone to discover. $1.4 million diverted from the restoration endowment into a shell corporation registered in Atlanta under the name Palmetto Bridge, LLC. Invoices for work never completed on properties Spencer had flagged for deferred maintenance. Contractor payments routed through accounts that traced, after 3 layers of redirection, to Spencer's brother-in-law. The fraud was meticulous but not invisible. Not to someone who had spent her career reading the architecture of money. Late that night, alone in her office, with the harbor lights shimmering 42 stories below, Victoria closed the laptop and pressed her palms against her eyes. She had the evidence. She had the weapon. She could end Spencer Calloway's career with a single presentation to the board, but the victory felt hollow. The office was enormous and silent, and the only thing Victoria wanted was a Thursday morning that smelled like coffee and sawdust. She looked toward her desk, where a photograph of Lily eating ice cream at the town fair sat in a small silver frame. She had never told anyone about that picture, certainly not Marcus. For the first time in her professional life, Victoria Sterling did not care about winning. She only cared about the man who had stopped showing up. The annual Charleston Heritage Foundation banquet filled the historic town hall on a warm Friday evening in late spring. Crystal chandeliers cast soft amber light across tables, draped in white linen. A jazz quartet opened with Stardust, and the melody drifted through the room like a memory no one could quite place. The building itself was nearly 200 years old, its walls lined with portraits of benefactors and preservationists who had spent their lives arguing that the past deserved a future. Marcus arrived with Rachel. He wore a dark blazer over a pressed white shirt, the only formal clothes he owned, and shoes he had polished that afternoon for the first time in months. Rachel wore a simple black dress and carried herself with quiet grace. They greeted neighbors, teachers from Lily's school, and local business owners, moving easily through the crowd as the evening settled into the comfortable hum of a community gathered to celebrate itself. Victoria arrived alone. She wore a deep navy evening dress. No jewelry except a thin gold chain her father had given her on her 30th birthday. She greeted donors, city council members, and Preservation Society directors with the composure she had perfected over a decade of public life. She thanked contributors. She listened to proposals. She smiled at every introduction. To everyone watching, she appeared exactly as expected. Polished, controlled, present. Only her eyes betrayed her. Several times during the first hour, her gaze drifted across the room toward Marcus before pulling away again, like a tide that could not decide whether to come in or retreat. Near the end of the evening, the mayor stepped to the podium and announced the annual community recognitions. One award, called the Quiet Hands Award, honored a local resident whose contributions to Charleston's architectural heritage had benefited dozens of families and historic properties over the past 3 years. The name called was Marcus Hayes. Applause filled the room. Marcus walked to the stage, visibly uncomfortable with the attention. The mayor spoke about volunteer repairs for elderly neighbors, the restoration of 6 historic facades, and years of skilled labor performed without any expectation of recognition or compensation. 3 men seated near the center aisle leaned toward each other. One muttered just loudly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "They are giving this to a renter now?" Another man chuckled softly. A third shook his head and reached for his wine glass. Marcus accepted the plaque and thanked the audience briefly, his voice steady but humble. He was stepping away from the microphone when Victoria appeared at the edge of the stage. She had not been introduced. She had not been scheduled to speak. She simply walked up, took the microphone from the mayor's hand with a glance that asked permission and received it, and turned to face the room. "My father, Harold Sterling, hired this man 6 years ago to restore a walnut staircase in our family home on Ligari Street." She paused, letting the silence carry the weight of the name. He called Marcus Hayes the finest craftsman he had met in 40 years. Then she named them, 6 historic buildings across Charleston that Marcus had quietly restored over the past 3 years. The Calhoun Row portico, the Ansonboro carriage house, the wrought iron balcony on Church Street that the Historical Society had classified as beyond repair, the pine flooring in the Huguenot Chapel Annex, the cypress shutters on Trad Street, the brick archway at the old Exchange Building that 3 licensed contractors had refused to touch. She spoke with precision and authority, naming dates and details that no one else in the room could have known. And beneath the precision, there was something that sounded, to anyone paying close attention, like pride that had been waiting years to announce itself. The applause that followed was different, louder, longer. The 3 men near the aisle did not clap, but they did not speak either. Rachel watched from her seat. She looked at Marcus standing on the stage, then at Victoria standing beside him, then back at Marcus. A quiet understanding crossed her face. Not surprise, confirmation. The kind that arrives when something you suspected for weeks finally reveals itself clearly enough to stop pretending otherwise. After the ceremony, guests filtered into the parking lot behind Maple Hall, beneath a sky crowded with stars. Marcus found Victoria standing alone at the far edge of the lot, beneath a single yellow street lamp. Her car was parked behind her, but she had not moved to open the door. She was simply standing there, keys in hand, staring at nothing in particular. His phone buzzed. A message from Rachel. "You do not need to explain anything. Go talk to her." Marcus crossed the parking lot and stopped a few feet away. "Victoria," he said quietly. She looked up. Surprise flickered across her face, followed by something she could not disguise quickly enough. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I think I should be asking you that." Neither spoke for a moment. The street lamp hummed faintly above them. Somewhere beyond the harbor, A ship horn sounded low and distant. "Why did you pull away?" Marcus asked. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. "I did not pull away." "You did." His voice remained gentle, but steady. "You stopped coming to the coffee shop. You stopped calling. You stopped showing up on Thursdays. You stopped being the person Lily asks about every morning at breakfast." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of 3 years of unspoken sentences. "You were building a future with Rachel," Victoria finally said, "and that bothered you." She looked away. Her fingers tightened around her car keys until the metal pressed white lines into her palm. "Please do not make this harder." Harder than what? For the first time, emotion cracked through her composure like a fault line running through marble. 3 years of restraint. 3 years of quiet devotion, hidden behind friendship and professional courtesy. All of it fracturing in a parking lot, beneath a Carolina sky. "Harder than watching someone I care about choose someone else," she said, and her voice broke on the last word. Marcus did not move. Victoria's eyes glistened beneath the amber light. "Do you know what the worst part was?" she whispered. "It was hearing Spencer Calloway call you his black tenant on Magnolia, and I said nothing to you about it. I told myself I was protecting you, but I was protecting myself. Because telling you meant explaining why it made me so angry. And that meant explaining why I kept a photograph of Lily eating ice cream on my desk, and why I counted every Thursday morning you did not show up." She took a shaking breath. "I told myself for 3 years that friendship was enough. That seeing you happy was enough." Her voice trembled. "But every time your daughter called my name, it felt like the best moment of my week. And every time you smiled when you talked about Rachel, I buried the same truth a little deeper." She looked directly at him. No walls, no composure, only truth standing alone in the dark. "She cannot love you the way I do." Marcus stood motionless. The parking lot was silent. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. Then he spoke. "Do you know what Lily told me a few weeks ago?" Victoria shook her head. "She said people sometimes choose what makes sense instead of what feels true." A tearful laugh escaped Victoria. "That sounds exactly like Lily." Marcus stepped closer. "Rachel is a wonderful person. But somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that comfort was the same thing as love." He paused. "It is not." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of every Thursday morning, every quiet repair, every silent moment they had stood beside each other without admitting what it meant. 2 hands did not touch, but the distance between them, after 3 years, finally closed. 2 weeks later, the Sterling Heritage Oversight Board voted 7-1 to suspend Spencer Calloway, pending a federal investigation into the diversion of $1.4 million from the Magnolia District Restoration Fund. His office was cleared by noon. His name was removed from the company directory before the end of the week. Della Boudreau attended the board meeting as a witness, carrying the same leather journal she had kept for nearly 40 years, and when asked whether Harold Sterling would have approved of the action, she answered with 2 words: without hesitation. Marcus met Rachel at the coffee shop on a quiet Wednesday afternoon. The conversation was brief, honest, and kind. Rachel stirred her tea and offered a gentle smile. "I saw it a long time ago," she said, "the way you two looked at each other when you thought no one was watching. Sometimes the best thing a person can do is recognize when to step aside." They parted as friends. No anger, no bitterness, just grace. Sometimes the kindest endings are the ones that make room for the truest beginnings. On a Sunday afternoon in late spring, Marcus, Victoria, and Lily sat together on a wooden bench at Battery Park, watching sailboats glide across Charleston Harbor. The late sun turned the water to gold and painted long shadows across the seawall. A warm breeze carried the scent of salt and jasmine from the gardens along the promenade. Lily sat between them, eating a dripping ice cream cone, her legs swinging gently above the ground. "Can I tell you both something?" she asked. "Of course," Marcus said. Lily smiled with the quiet confidence of a child who had been paying closer attention than anyone realized. "I knew this was going to happen." Victoria laughed. "For how long?" "Years." Marcus nearly dropped his cup. Lily nodded, as though this were the most obvious fact in the world. "You always looked at each other the way people look at home." No one spoke after that. Not because the silence was awkward, but because it was complete. The kind that arrives when nothing needs to be explained, and no words could improve what already exists. Victoria reached for Marcus's hand. He took it gently. Lily leaned against them both and closed her eyes. Later that evening, they returned to 14 Magnolia Street. The porch light glowed warm against the white clapboard siding. The hanging ferns swayed in the evening breeze. The old boards groaned softly the way they always had, marking the arrival of footsteps the house had learned to recognize. Marcus stopped on the bottom step. He turned toward Victoria and opened his mouth to say the words he had prepared for 3 nights. Words about different worlds. Words about not being enough. The apology he believed she deserved for every silence, every withdrawal, every moment he allowed the distance between their lives to convince him that love was something the world would never permit them. Victoria lifted one finger and pressed it softly against his lips. She did not need his apology. She needed him to stay. Behind the screen door, Lily watched for a moment, smiled to herself, and quietly stepped back inside, leaving the two of them alone on the porch, with the sea breeze, and the creaking boards, and the sound of Charleston settling into evening. The harbor shimmered beyond the rooftops. The stars appeared one by one above the church steeples, and somewhere in the old heart of a city that had spent centuries learning the difference between what it built and what it preserved, 2 people finally stood in the same truth they had been circling for 3 years. Charleston is prettier if you are patient with it. And for the first time, both of them knew they had been patient long enough to deserve this.